It was a humid Friday night in downtown Raleigh, the kind that pressed against your skin and made the air feel heavy with noise and sweat. The kind of night when bars overflowed with laughter that sounded just a little too forced, and where men with polished badges or empty wallets tried to drown the week's weight in cheap beer and louder music. Neon lights flickered across cracked sidewalks, painting passing faces in sharp colors, red, blue, and gold. The crowd outside Murphy's bar was thick, restless, and drunk with confidence. Inside, the noise was chaos, wrapped in country music and the smell of spilled whiskey. At the far end of the bar, two men sat close to the wall. They didn't say much, but their presence turned heads. Tall, solidly built, and identical in every way, they carried themselves with a quiet kind of control that didn't belong in a place like this. They weren't locals. Their calm was too steady, their movements too precise. To the regulars, they were just two black guys who looked like they could handle themselves. To anyone paying closer attention, there was something about them, something contained, disciplined, almost dangerous. The twins, Marcus and Malcolm Price, hadn't planned on staying long. They'd come to town on leave, visiting their mother who lived just outside the city. She'd begged them to go out, to relax for once, to stop living like soldiers even when they were home. But habits like that don't fade easily. Even off duty, they scanned exits, noticed hands, read eyes. They laughed softly with each other, but even their laughter felt restrained, like men who had seen too much to let their guard down completely. Around them, the bar pulsed with noise. A college game was played on the TV above the counter, the crowd roaring every time a player scored. Glasses clinked, boots scraped against the floor, and someone in a corner sang off-key to a jukebox tune. On the surface, it was ordinary, a southern bar on a hot night. But under the laughter, there was an edge. You could feel it in the stares that lingered a little too long, in the way conversations hushed when the twins passed by. Raleigh wasn't a place where two tall black men could disappear into the crowd without being noticed. Not here. Not in a bar where most faces looked the same and carried the same silent expectations. A few eyes followed them with curiosity, a few with unease, and some with quiet resentment. Marcus leaned back, sipping his beer slowly. "Feels like everyone's staring," he muttered. Malcolm smirked. "They are. Just act like they're not." It was their usual rhythm. Marcus, the older by 6 minutes, more cautious, more deliberate. Malcolm, the one who met tension with a grin. If Marcus was the shield, Malcolm was the blade. They didn't talk about what they did for a living. Not to strangers, not to anyone. To the world, they were just veterans home for a visit. But the truth was heavier. Marcus was a Navy SEAL commander, trained to make impossible calls under fire. Malcolm, a Marine Corps captain, is known for leading men through the kind of missions that never made the news. But tonight, they were just brothers trying to forget what that meant. Across the bar, 3 men in uniform stood near the pool table. County cops. Their badges caught the light every time they leaned over to take a shot. The tallest one, a broad man with a red face and small, watchful eyes, had been watching the twins since they walked in. He laughed too loudly, drank too quickly, and carried that look, like authority was something he wore more than earned. His name was Officer Dean Carver. Locals knew him as a man who didn't like questions, didn't like being ignored, and didn't like being challenged. He took another sip from his glass and nudged the younger cop beside him. "You see those two?" he said, voice low but sharp. "Don't look like they're from around here." The younger cop shrugged. "Just having a drink, Dean." "Yeah," Carver said, squinting. "But that one—" He nodded toward Malcolm. "He's been watching the room since he walked in. Military, maybe. Or trouble." Trouble. That was always the word men like Carver used when they felt their control slipping, when someone didn't fit the mold, didn't bow to the silent rules. The twins didn't notice at first. They were too busy talking about their mother's stubborn garden, about how she still watered the same dying plant by her window every morning. But Marcus felt it eventually. The shift in air, the kind that always came before confrontation. Years in service had sharpened his instincts to the point where danger wasn't something he saw. It was something he felt. He glanced at the mirror behind the bar, watching the cops through the reflection. Carver was still staring. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Don't look now," he said quietly, "but we've got company." Malcolm didn't turn around. "Cops? Yeah. Let them watch." Outside, thunder grumbled somewhere in the distance. The air felt heavier now, like the night itself was holding its breath. Inside Murphy's, laughter continued, but it had taken on a strange rhythm, forced, hollow, the kind that people use to cover tension they don't want to name. Carver finally stepped away from the pool table, his drink half finished. He didn't stumble. He wasn't drunk enough for that, but his stride had the swagger of a man who thought a badge permitted him. The bar quieted slightly as he walked toward the twins' table, his two partners following behind. Marcus saw them coming in the mirror. He didn't move. Malcolm set down his glass and leaned back, the hint of a smile still on his face, though his eyes had gone hard. In a bar full of noise, the silence around their table grew thick. Somewhere near the jukebox, a woman laughed too loudly, trying to ignore what everyone now felt, a storm forming in plain sight. Marcus's voice was calm when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Keep your hands visible." Malcolm chuckled, but his tone was dry. "You think they'll ask nicely?" "Not their style." The three cops stopped in front of them. For a moment no one spoke. Only the hum of the air conditioner and the faint music in the background broke the stillness. Then Carver leaned forward, resting one hand on the table between them. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, voice smooth but sharp at the edges. "You boys from around here?" And just like that, the night changed. In a city where power often spoke through tone and silence, this was how it began, not with violence, not with raised voices, but with a question wrapped in authority and suspicion, the kind that made ordinary people freeze. But Marcus and Malcolm weren't ordinary. They had faced things far worse than this. They just didn't know that tonight, in this small-town bar, their patience would be tested more than their training ever had. Outside, rain started to fall, soft at first, then harder, each drop hitting the windows like a warning. Inside, two brothers sat under the dim lights, unaware that the next few minutes would strip open everything they believed about control, respect, and the price of staying silent. Carver's question hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. The twins didn't answer right away, not because they didn't hear him, but because they knew exactly what kind of question it was. Marcus met his eyes first, calm and measured. "Just passing through," he said. His voice was low, respectful, but not submissive. Carver didn't like that. You could see it in the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his jaw tightened as if someone had just denied him something he thought he was owed. "Passing through," he repeated, as if the words themselves carried suspicion. "You military?" Malcolm tilted his head, eyes steady. "Something like that." That should have been the end of it. A question is asked, an answer given, and everyone goes back to pretending the world is fair. But Carver stepped closer, the smell of cheap whiskey heavy on his breath. His fingers drummed on the table. "You two look familiar," he said. "Mind showing some ID?" Marcus sighed softly and pulled out his wallet. "Sure," he said. "No problem." He handed over his driver's license. Malcolm did the same, though the irritation on his face was harder to hide. Carver studied the IDs longer than necessary, eyes flicking between the photos and their faces. "Marcus Price. Malcolm Price," he said slowly. "Twins, huh?" "Since birth," Malcolm said dryly. Carver's lip twitched, but he didn't smile. "What brings you to Raleigh, gentlemen?" "Family," Marcus said. "Our mother lives nearby. We're visiting. One of the younger officers, Officer Reed, shifted awkwardly behind Carver. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes flicking between the twins and his superior. "Dean, maybe let it go," he muttered. "They're not doing anything wrong." Carver shot him a glare that froze him in place. "Relax," he said sharply. "Just asking a question." Then he turned back to the twins, his tone soft but mocking. "You'd be surprised how many people come through here with fake stories. Just trying to keep things safe, that's all." Marcus's patience was thinning, but he stayed steady. "We appreciate that, officer. But unless there's something wrong, we'd like to finish our drinks." The words were polite, but they carried a weight, a boundary. And men like Carver didn't like boundaries drawn for them. His eyes darkened. "Watch your tone," he said quietly. At another table, a couple stopped talking, pretending not to listen. The bartender wiped the counter more slowly than before, keeping one eye on the scene. The air in the bar had changed again, thicker, tenser. You could almost hear the sound of lines being crossed. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, voice calm but edged. "Officer, we're not here to cause trouble, but we're not here to be talked down to either." For a moment, Carver said nothing. Then, with a thin smile, he set both IDs down on the table. "Enjoy your night," he said, voice low. He turned and walked back toward the pool table, but the look he gave his partners said it wasn't over. The night went on, but the mood never recovered. The twins tried to brush it off, ordering another round, trying to talk about old stories from their time overseas. But every time the door opened, every time a glass broke or someone laughed too loud, they felt that tension crawl back. Marcus kept glancing toward the pool table. Carver and his men were still there, still watching. He knew what kind of men they were. He'd seen their type in every corner of the world. The ones who wore authority like armor, who turned power into sport. And something about Carver's stare said he wasn't finished. Outside, rain poured harder, streaking the windows. The world blurred behind it, like the night itself was trying to hide what was coming. Carver's partner, Officer Reed, finally spoke again. "Dean, come on, man, they didn't do anything." Carver ignored him, chalking his cue stick and staring at the twins. "You ever wonder," he said, voice low but sharp, "why guys like that walk in here like they own the place? Like they're better than everyone?" The third cop, Miller, shook his head. "They're just sitting there, Dean." Carver took his shot, sinking a ball hard enough that it cracked against the side of the table. "You don't see it," he said. "That arrogance. You give people like that an inch, they'll take the whole damn place." It wasn't really about the twins. It was about something much older, something Carver had carried for years. The kind of resentment that doesn't come from one night, but from a lifetime of feeling small. Marcus and Malcolm had become symbols in his head, representations of everything he thought was being taken from him. He'd grown up in a small town outside Raleigh, the son of a factory worker who lost his job when the plant closed. His father blamed everyone but himself. Carver listened to that blame for years, let it soak into him like poison. By the time he joined the force, that bitterness had shape and purpose. It became controlled, and men like Marcus, calm, confident, and unafraid, threatened that control just by existing. Back at the table, Malcolm noticed movement. Carver had set down his cue stick and started walking toward the bar again. Marcus's voice was low. "He's coming back." Malcolm exhaled through his nose. "I was hoping he wouldn't." This time, Carver didn't come empty-handed. He had that false smile again, the kind that tried to look friendly but never reached the eyes. "How about a round on me?" he asked. Marcus stared at him. "No, thank you." Carver grinned wider. "Come on. I'm trying to be nice." Malcolm leaned forward. "You've done enough trying." The bartender froze, holding a glass mid-air. Carver's grin faltered. "Excuse me?" "I said we're good," Malcolm repeated, voice flat. Something snapped then, something small, invisible, but real. Carver's pride couldn't take it. In his head, this wasn't about two men refusing a drink. It was about two men challenging his authority in public, in front of his partners, in front of witnesses. He laughed once, short and cold. "You got a smart mouth." Marcus stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Officer," he said carefully, "we're done here. Let's not make this worse." Carver stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Or what? You gonna do something?" Malcolm stood too. The bar had gone silent again. All eyes were on them. One of the cops, Miller, moved forward, trying to defuse it. "Dean, stop. Let it go." But Carver didn't stop. His voice rose. "You think you can talk to me like that? In my town?" That was the moment everyone realized how far this had gone. It wasn't about law anymore. It was about ego, about power. Marcus's voice stayed level, but you could see the tension in his shoulders. "You're out of line, officer." Carver smirked. "And what the hell are you going to do about it?" Marcus reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately. The move made Carver flinch. His hand went to his holster, eyes sharp with sudden fear. But instead of a weapon, Marcus pulled out his wallet again. He opened it and held up an ID card. "Commander Marcus Price," he said evenly. "United States Navy SEALs." The room went still. Malcolm pulled his own ID from his back pocket. "Captain Malcolm Price, U.S. Marine Corps." His tone was colder. "You picked the wrong night, officer." Carver's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His partners stared in disbelief. The bartender whispered something under his breath. Reed was the first to speak. "Jesus, Dean." But the damage was done. The crowd had seen everything, the aggression, the insults, the threats. Carver's authority, the thing he clung to so tightly, had just crumbled in front of everyone. And men like him didn't take humiliation well. He forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Hey, no harm done. Just misunderstanding." Marcus's stare didn't move. A misunderstanding could have gotten someone hurt. Carver nodded stiffly, eyes darting toward the door. "Yeah, well, enjoy your night." He turned away, but his face had gone hard and cold. Behind his eyes, something darker was forming, a mix of shame, anger, and the kind of hate that doesn't go away quietly. The twins left soon after. They paid their tab, nodded to the bartender, and walked out into the rain. The night air was cool now, washing away the heat and noise of the bar. For a few blocks, they didn't speak. Then Malcolm finally said, "You saw his face?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, he's not done." And he was right. Over the next few days, Carver's anger grew. His pride had been cut open in front of his peers, and every time he replayed the moment in his head, it burned worse. He started asking questions about the twins, about their mother's address, about why men like that were even in his town. Reed tried to talk him down, told him to drop it, but Carver wouldn't. He told himself it wasn't personal, that he was just making sure everything was in order. But deep down, he wanted payback. Marcus and Malcolm spent the next few days helping their mother fix things around the house, pretending like nothing was wrong. But both of them felt it, the shadow following them. The same car was parked at the corner of the street twice in one day, the same headlights trailing them at night. Marcus tried to stay calm, tried to remind himself they were on U.S. soil now, not in enemy territory. But the paranoia that kept them alive overseas had returned. "Maybe we should report it," Malcolm said one night. "To whom?" Marcus asked bitterly. "The same department he works for." The rain returned that evening, same as the night at Murphy's bar. Only this time, it didn't cool the air, it thickened it. Carver sat in his car across the street, engine running, eyes fixed on the Price home. His hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. He told himself he just wanted to talk, just wanted to make things clear. But in his gut, something else pulsed, something raw and ugly that had nothing to do with justice. He looked down at his badge, then at the gun on the seat beside him. His reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like a cop anymore. It looked like a man who had already crossed a line. The storm outside grew louder. Inside the house, the twins sat at the kitchen table, unaware that the night they thought had ended at Murphy's bar was only beginning. And somewhere in that storm, between guilt and hate, something was about to snap. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It came down in steady sheets that blurred the world outside into shifting shadows and pale streaks of light. The street in front of the Price home was empty, except for one car sitting under a flickering street lamp. Its headlights were off. The engine was quiet. Inside, Officer Dean Carver sat gripping his steering wheel, his mind spiraling through the same scene over and over. The bar, the laughter, the humiliation. He could still hear the low murmur of the crowd when the twins had revealed who they were, the looks his fellow officers had given him afterward, the way his authority had evaporated like smoke. It wasn't about race, he told himself again, though even he didn't believe it anymore. It wasn't about pride either. It was about respect, or the lack of it. That's what he told himself as the rain drummed against the windshield, matching the quick rhythm of his pulse. He took a long drink from the flask in his jacket and watched the house across the street, the warm light glowing through the living room window. Inside, he saw movement, a shadow crossing, a man's figure. Marcus. Carver's breathing quickened. His hand brushed over the gun resting on the passenger seat. He wasn't supposed to be here. He knew that. But knowing and stopping were two different things. In his head, he wasn't planning to kill anyone, just to talk, to remind them that there were consequences for disrespect. Maybe scare them a little, just enough to feel like himself again. Inside the house, Marcus was in the kitchen with his brother. The clock above the stove ticked softly. Their mother had gone to bed early, worn out from a long day. The brothers were finishing a quiet conversation when Malcolm suddenly went still. "You hear that?" he whispered. Marcus paused, listening. The faint hum of rain, the steady drip from the roof, but underneath, something else. A low crunch of gravel outside. Marcus stood slowly and walked to the window. He pulled the curtain back just enough to see a shape by the curb. A car, half hidden under the streetlight. "Someone's out there," he said quietly. Malcolm came up beside him. His eyes narrowed. "Same car as before." Marcus didn't move. He stared for a long moment, then sighed. "Stay here. I'll go check." "Marcus, I'll handle it." He pulled on his jacket, tucked his phone in his pocket, and stepped out into the rain. The air was cold, the kind that bit into your lungs. The moment he closed the door behind him, the night swallowed him whole. Across the street, Carver's hand tightened around his gun. Through the blurry glass, he saw Marcus walking toward him, his tall frame cutting through the rain. There was no fear in his steps, no hesitation. That angered Carver even more. Marcus stopped a few feet from the car. He kept his hands visible, palms out. "You've been sitting here a long time," he said evenly. "You want to tell me why?" Carver stepped out, rain immediately soaking his uniform. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he said, his voice trembling, not from cold, but from rage barely held together. Marcus's eyes stayed on him, calm, controlled. "You're drunk. Go home before you do something you'll regret." Carver took a step closer. "You embarrassed me in front of my men. You did that yourself." Carver's hand twitched toward his holster. Marcus noticed. "Don't," he warned. Malcolm appeared at the doorway of the house, shouting through the rain. Marcus, what's going on? Stay inside, Marcus called back. But Malcolm was already moving toward them. Carver's head snapped toward the voice, his eyes darting between the two brothers. Something inside him broke. Whatever control he had left dissolved in the downpour. He drew his gun, pointing it at Marcus. Don't move! Marcus froze, hands still up. His heart thudded, but his training kicked in. He kept his voice calm. Put the gun down, officer. Carver's hands shook, his words slurred. You think you're better than me, don't you? You think that badge makes you untouchable? No one's better than anyone here, Marcus said quietly. But you're crossing a line you can't come back from. The rain hit harder, bouncing off the street like static. Malcolm was closing in now, his voice rising. Dean, stop. You don't want to do this. Carver turned just for a second, just long enough for panic to mix with confusion. Lightning flashed, lighting up their faces in stark white light. And then, in that split second, Carver fired. The sound was deafening. Marcus stumbled back, his hand clutching his side. The pain was instant, white-hot, spreading like fire. He fell to his knees, his breath caught in his throat. The rain mixed with blood on the asphalt. Malcolm's scream cut through the storm. Marcus! He ran forward, dropping beside his brother. The world seemed to tilt around him. Stay with me, man! Stay with me! Marcus's eyes fluttered. It's okay, he gasped. Don't let him. Carver stood frozen, the gun still raised, his mouth open, but no sound coming out. He hadn't meant to shoot, not really. He told himself that again and again, but the sight in front of him shattered every excuse he tried to build. Malcolm stood, his face twisted with grief and fury. You killed him! Back off! Carver shouted, stepping back. His hands shook violently. He moved. I thought he reached for something. He didn't, Malcolm roared. You shot an unarmed man. He took a step forward, rage consuming the shock. Carver's gun trembled in his hands. Don't make me! But Malcolm didn't stop. His training, his instincts, everything inside him screamed for control, but control was gone. All that was left was the sound of his brother gasping for air. He lunged. The two men collided in the rain, the gun flying out of Carver's hand and skidding across the pavement. They struggled, fists and elbows, slipping in mud and water. Carver swung wildly. Malcolm ducked and slammed him against the car. The impact cracked the window. You killed my brother! He shouted, his voice raw, breaking. Carver's hand scrambled for the gun, but Malcolm was faster. He kicked it away, sending it spinning under the car. Sirens wailed in the dis. Tants! Someone must have heard the shot. Red and blue lights flickered faintly through the rain. Carver's face was pale, his breath coming in gasps. I didn't mean to. Malcolm grabbed him by the collar, his eyes burning. You think that matters? For a long second, neither moved. The sirens grew louder. Carver's eyes flicked toward the street, panic taking over. In that moment of distraction, Malcolm shoved him backward. Hard. Carver slipped on the wet pavement, hit his head against the side mirror, and crumpled to the ground. Malcolm staggered back, breathing hard. He looked down at Carver, motionless, unconscious. Then he turned to his brother. Marcus was lying in the rain, barely conscious. Blood soaked his shirt. Malcolm fell to his knees beside him, pressing his hands over the wound. Stay with me, Marcus, please. Marcus's lips moved, his voice barely a whisper. Don't let them twist this. His hand went still. Malcolm froze. The sound of the sirens was deafening now, the red and blue lights flashing across his face. He sat there unmoving, his brother's body in his arms, as the rain poured down. When the first patrol cars arrived, officers jumped out, guns drawn. They saw the two men on the ground, the fallen officer and the bleeding man, and they didn't know what had happened. Hands where I can see them, one of them shouted. Malcolm didn't move, he didn't even look up. The only thing he heard was the rain. The only thing he felt was his brother's weight, heavy and lifeless in his arms. One officer approached carefully, shouting again, but Malcolm's voice broke through, cracked and hollow. "He shot him," he said. "He shot my brother." "Sir, step away from the body." But he didn't. His eyes were locked on Marcus's face, pale and still. Somewhere deep inside, something shattered. The calm, the discipline, the faith that justice still meant something. Carver began to stir on the ground, groaning. His face was bloodied, his expression dazed. When he saw what he'd done, he froze. The reality hit him all at once. "What did I—" he started, but the words fell apart in his mouth. Officers rushed toward him, pulling him up, asking questions he couldn't answer. His eyes darted toward Malcolm, who was still kneeling in the rain, still holding his brother. For a moment, their eyes met. Carver's lips trembled. "I didn't mean to—" Malcolm didn't answer. His silence was worse than anger. When the paramedics arrived, they tried to pull Marcus's body away. Malcolm resisted at first, but eventually he let go. His hands were stained red, trembling. The air smelled like rain and iron and loss. As the ambulance doors closed, Malcolm stood alone in the street, water dripping from his face. Around him, chaos erupted, cops shouting, radios crackling, commands being barked. But none of it reached him. His world had gone quiet. In the confusion, Carver sat in the back of a patrol car, head in his hands, rocking slightly. His uniform was soaked, his badge glinting weakly under the flashing lights. He kept repeating the same words over and over. It was an accident. He moved. He moved. But the more he said it, the emptier it sounded. And as the night dragged on, Ruth settled over the street like fog, thick, suffocating, and irreversible. One brother is dead, one broken. One man's rage disguised as authority had turned a simple night into tragedy. And no matter what the reports would say later, no matter what stories would be rewritten, everyone who had been there that night knew the truth. The rain didn't wash anything clean. It only made the blood harder to forget. The aftermath began quietly, almost eerily, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the wet pavement outside the bar, illuminating stunned faces and trembling hands. The echoes of gunfire had barely faded when the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The bar, that had once been filled with laughter and music, was now a scene of shattered glass, overturned chairs, and silent disbelief. The officers who had drawn their weapons stood frozen, staring at the twins, one bleeding, the other crouched beside him, pressing his hands against the wound while barking orders no one dared to ignore. "Call it in!" shouted Jordan, his voice sharp and commanding. "Officer down! Now!" But the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man lying on the floor, his chest rising in shallow, painful breaths, wasn't a criminal. He was a captain in the Navy. His twin brother, whose hands were now slick with his blood, was a commander in the SEALs. And the men who had aimed their guns at them just moments ago were local police officers who had mistaken strength for threat, confidence for defiance, and skin color for danger. The officers' faces were pale now, their bravado drained. One of them, Officer Matthews, dropped his weapon and took a step back, shaking his head as if trying to undo what had happened. I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know who they were." But Jordan's eyes were cold. "You shouldn't have needed to." In the chaos that followed, paramedics rushed in, cutting through the bar's tense silence. Cameras from nearby bystanders started flashing, phones recording every second. Within hours, the footage would spread across the internet. 2 black men in military uniforms being harassed, assaulted, and shot by officers in a bar they had been invited to. The story would ignite the country. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that existed was the sound of the ambulance doors closing and the haunting question in Jordan's mind. What if his brother didn't make it? Outside, the night air was thick with whispers and regret. The crowd that had gathered, patrons from the bar, nearby residents, stood divided between outrage and disbelief. Some shouted at the police, calling them murderers. Others watched in silence, afraid to pick a side. A few officers tried to control the crowd, but their voices were drowned out by chants. "Say his name! Say his name!" At the hospital, the sterile lights and the smell of disinfectant felt almost unreal. Jordan sat in the waiting room, his shirt stained red, his hands still trembling. Reporters had already begun circling like vultures, hungry for statements. But he said nothing. Not yet. He just stared at the floor, jaw clenched, every muscle in his body straining against the storm of emotion that threatened to break him. The doctors eventually came out, their faces grave but hopeful. His brother, Captain Malik Hayes, had survived. The bullet had missed his heart by inches. It was a miracle, they said. But Jordan didn't believe in miracles anymore. Not after what he had just seen. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Headlines blared across every news network. Navy officers mistaken for threats by police in violent bar incident. Some outlets painted it as a misunderstanding. Others called it a racial tragedy. Commentators debated whether the officers had acted out of fear or prejudice, but none of them truly understood the depth of what had been lost. Not just the physical wound Malik carried, but the fracture in trust that would never fully heal. The department scrambled to control the narrative. Statements were released about regretful miscommunication and procedural mistakes. But the body cam footage told a different story. It showed the officers mocking, provoking, and escalating. It showed Malik trying to de-escalate, identifying himself repeatedly. It showed Jordan stepping in only after one of them shoved his brother. And finally, it showed the gun going off. Public outrage grew. Protests formed outside the precinct. Civil rights organizations demanded justice. Politicians gave statements, but most of them sounded rehearsed, hollow. The officers were placed on leave, pending investigation. But the damage was already done. Inside the hospital, Malik's recovery was slow. The physical pain was one thing, but the mental scars ran deeper. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head, the fear, the disbelief, the sound of the gun. "I've led missions overseas," he told Jordan quietly one night. "I've seen men die in deserts and jungles, but never once did I think I'd almost die in my own country. In a bar." Jordan didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. He had always believed in discipline, in law, in the structure of command. But that night had shattered something sacred. As days turned into weeks, investigations began. The Justice Department got involved, pressured by the mounting public fury. The officers' stories changed with every interview. Some claimed they feared for their lives. Others said the twins had been aggressive. But body cam footage left little room for lies. When the truth came out, that the officers had joked about putting someone in their place before approaching the twins, the public outrage exploded. The bar's owner released his own footage, showing the twins calmly ordering drinks, joking with patrons, and posing for photos. It was clear. They hadn't been a threat. They had been targets. But even as justice seemed within reach, Malik's trust in the system eroded further. Reporters called him a hero. Commentators labeled him a victim. But neither word fit. He didn't want pity or praise. He wanted change. Meanwhile, Jordan's anger simmered beneath the surface. He began speaking out, appearing on interviews, challenging the police union's statements, and demanding accountability. He used his platform not just for his brother, but for every name that had come before and after. But the cost was high. The military frowned upon public political involvement. His superiors warned him to step back. "You're crossing lines, Commander," they said, but he didn't care. He had seen what lines could do, how they could separate justice from convenience, truth from control. The small town where it all happened would never be the same. The bar closed down. The officers involved were eventually charged, but the trial dragged on. Protesters filled the courthouse steps. Some days, Malik appeared in court, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. Other days, he stayed home, trying to rebuild his strength, his faith. The once normal brothers, heroes in the eyes of their comrades, respected by their peers, had become symbols of a broker's system. And though they survived, something in them had changed forever. In quiet moments, Malik would look out the window and say, "It's strange, isn't it? How we fight for freedom abroad, but still have to earn it here." Jordan never answered out loud, but deep down, he knew exactly what his brother meant. The aftermath wasn't just about justice. It was about loss. Loss of trust, loss of peace, loss of the illusion that rank or honor could protect them from prejudice. The story had become bigger than them, an emblem of pain, resilience, and the heavy truth of what it meant to wear both a uniform and black skin in America. And as the months passed, the world moved on to new stories, new tragedies. But for the twins, the sound of that gunshot would never fade. It echoed in every heartbeat, every breath, every quiet night when the world felt too heavy to bear. The trial that followed stretched on for months, filled with every twist and manipulation that the legal system could produce. The officers who had fired their weapons sat in court in crisp suits, their expressions rehearsed, their lawyers carefully painting them as men who made a tragic mistake under pressure. But the footage, the eyewitnesses, and the national outrage made it impossible to hide what really happened that night. Their badges had become symbols of fear rather than authority, and no speech or excuse could erase that image. When the verdict finally came, it was bittersweet. The officer who pulled the trigger was convicted of aggravated assault, not attempted murder. The others were found guilty of misconduct and suspended indefinitely. The sentence, 7 years in prison, eligible for parole after 4, felt hollow to many. Justice had been served, technically. But for Malik and Jordan, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like survival with scars that would never fade. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for statements. Malik, standing tall in his Navy uniform, faced the cameras one last time. "We didn't come here for revenge," he said quietly. "We came here for truth. But the truth is, our lives will never go back to what they were. No verdict can give us that back." His voice didn't shake, but his eyes said everything. Behind him, Jordan stood silent, watching the crowd that had gathered. Activists, veterans, ordinary people. Some cheered, others cried. A few just stood there, unsure what to feel. After the trial, the media frenzy began to fade. Another story would take its place soon enough. But the impact lingered. Police departments across the country began holding mandatory training sessions on racial bias and escalation. For a brief moment, it felt like the system was learning something, like maybe the sacrifice had meant something. Yet beneath it all, a quiet cynicism remained. People had seen this pattern before. Outrage, protest, reform, and then silence. For the twins, life after the storm was quieter, but lonelier. Malik retired from active service months later, citing medical reasons. The bullet wound had healed, but the nightmares had not. He moved to a small coastal town, away from the noise and the headlines. There he found a sort of peace in fishing and long walks by the water. But every time he saw flashing lights in the distance, his body tensed, his breath caught. A fear had carved itself deep into his bones. Jordan, on the other hand, couldn't let go. He became a public speaker, traveling across the country to talk about accountability and justice. His speeches weren't about hate or blame, they were about responsibility, about the power of empathy and the cost of ignorance. But sometimes, late at night, when the applause had faded and the hotel room was silent, he'd look at his reflection and wonder if any of it truly mattered. They had both been men of command once, leaders who believed in structure, duty, and honor. But the night in that bar had shown them that no title, no medal, no uniform could make them safe from the prejudices buried deep in others. That truth had changed them forever. Months later, Malik and Jordan met again on a quiet Sunday morning. They sat on a pier, watching the sunrise bleed into the ocean. For a while, neither spoke. Then Malik said, "You ever think about how it all could have gone differently? If they'd just listened for 2 more seconds?" Jordan nodded. "Yeah, I think about it every day." Silence stretched between them. Then Jordan added softly, "But maybe it had to happen. Not for us, but for everyone watching. Maybe someone out there saw that video and thought twice the next time they reached for a gun." Malik gave a tired smile. "You still believe in people, huh?" "Yeah," Jordan said. "It's the only thing that keeps me from becoming like them." For a moment, the brothers just sat there, letting the waves fill the space between their words. The story of the Hayes twins became more than a headline. It became a mirror, a reflection of the complicated truth about justice and power in America, how quickly authority could turn into violence, and how deeply fear could shape a man's decisions. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. Why were 2 decorated officers seen as threats before they were seen as men? Why did fear speak louder than reason? Over time, documentaries were made, books were written, but Malik never watched or read any of them. He said he didn't need to relive it. He had already lived it once, and that was enough. Jordan, however, attended every panel, every discussion, determined to keep the story alive. Not for fame, but because he couldn't bear the thought of it happening to someone else. The legal system moved on. The town tried to forget. But across the country, quiet ripples of change began to form. Departments reviewed their policies. Some schools even used the Hayes case to teach lessons on racial bias and justice. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. Years later, Malik visited the grave of one of the officers who had died in prison after a fight with another inmate. He stood there for a long time, the wind cold against his face. Then he whispered, "I forgive you." It wasn't for the officer. It was for himself, because holding on to the anger had almost destroyed him. When he left, he didn't look back. The story of that night became a chapter in America's long, unfinished struggle between justice and prejudice, authority and accountability. It showed that even the most disciplined, honorable men could be reduced to stereotypes in the eyes of fear. It showed how fragile truth could be when power dictated perception. And it revealed the deepest irony of all, that 2 brothers trained to protect freedom had nearly lost theirs in a place that claimed to represent it. In the end, justice had its form, but not its spirit. Laws had changed, policies rewritten, but wounds remained, some visible, others buried under layers of silence. Malik found peace in solitude. Jordan found purpose in action. But both carried the same invisible weight, the knowledge that being right hadn't saved them, and being innocent hadn't protected them. And yet, in their quiet resilience, there was a kind of victory. Because even after all the pain, they were still standing. Still brothers. Still human. Their story, like so many before and after, became less about what was taken from them and more about what they refused to lose, their dignity, their truth, and the belief that one day the world might finally learn to see beyond the color of a man's skin and recognize the uniform